Good morning, everyone. My name is Mariella Popolla, and today I will talk about the manosphere in digital gender-based violence. More specifically, I will try to show how a set of male-dominated online communities, discourses, and emotional spaces can contribute to the normalization, circulation, and amplification of gender-based violence in digital environments. The structure of this meeting is quite simple. First, I will define what the manosphere is. Second, I will explain why it can be understood as part of a broader backlash against feminism and gender equality. Third, I will focus on the manosphere as an emotional community, that is, as a space where negative emotions such as frustration, humiliation, resentment, and anger are collected, interpreted, and redirected. Then I will connect this to digital gender-based violence, what it means, why there is no single definition, and which forms it can take online. Finally, I will discuss the role of platforms, algorithms, attention economies, and visibility. And I will conclude by reflecting on younger generations, victimhood, and secondary victimization. Let me begin with the first question. What is the manosphere? The manosphere is not a single organization, a single movement, or a single website. It is a heterogeneous ecosystem of male-dominated online communities, forums, influencers, channels, profiles, and platforms. These spaces can be very different from one another, but they often share some common elements. And that's why we can talk about manosphere. A strong criticism of feminism, the idea that men are now under attack, the belief that gender equality has gone too far, and a nostalgic desire to restore supposedly natural gender hierarchies. Inside the manosphere, we can find different groups and vocabularies. For example, men's rights activists who claim to defend men's rights, often in opposition to feminism. Pick-up artist communities, or PUAs, who develop techniques of seduction aimed at obtaining sexual access to women. Red pill communities, who claim that men need to wake up from a society supposedly dominated by women and by feminism. And incel communities, or involuntary celibates, they become really, really popular after the airing of the Netflix series Adolescence. And they are composed of men and young men who define themselves as excluded from intimate and sexual relationship or intercourse, often blaming women for this exclusion. Then we have the men going their own way, that refers to men who claim to reject relationship with women altogether. Some of these spaces also overlap with far-right, racist, nationalist, anti-gender discourses and ableist discourses. The manosphere is therefore plural and internally differentiated. However, it is, how we already said, connected by recurring narratives. One of these narratives is the idea that masculinity is in crisis because women, feminism, and gender equality have taken power away from men. Another narrative is that women are manipulative, hypergamous, irrational, cruel, or responsible for men's suffering. And a third recurring narrative is that men are the true victims of contemporary gender relations. This is why the manosphere can be read as part of the broader backlash. And by backlash, I mean a conservative and anti-feminism reaction against women's rights, feminist movements, and transformation more in general in gender relations. The manosphere doesn't simply express individual frustration. It organizes frustration through shared vocabularies, shared enemies, shared narratives, and shared emotional styles. This is especially visible in its language. Terms such as alpha, beta, chad, soy boy are not just internet slang, they build a symbolic hierarchy. Some men are represented as dominant, successful, and sexually desirable, while others are represented as weak, feminized, or subordinated. Women are often reduced to beauty, sexual availability, status, or betrayal. In this sense, the language of the manosphere classifies bodies, ranks people, and produces a gendered moral order. It teaches who is valuable and who is not, who deserves attention and who doesn't, who is desirable and who is disposable. Okay? But the manosphere is not only ideological, it is also affective. We can think of many manosphere spaces as emotional communities. They are not held together only by explicit political beliefs or anti-feminist explicit arguments. They are also held together by shared emotions. Which emotions? Discomfort, loneliness, resentment, humiliation, frustration, and anger. Okay? This matters because people do not necessarily enter these spaces from their most violent or explicitly misogynistic side, okay? This is really important. They may arrive through the periphery. They may be looking for explanations, advice, self-help content, dating tips, even gym content, okay? Or looking simply for a space where they can share some form of frustration or emotion, okay? At this peripheral level, these spaces may appear less aggressive, less extremist, or even sometimes supportive. But emotional communities do not merely receive emotions, okay? They organize them and they give them a vocabulary, a cause, a target, and a direction. Loneliness can be, for example, translated into resentment against women. Romantic rejection can be interpreted as a proof that feminism has destroyed gender relations. Shame can become anger, and personal frustration can be transformed into a collective narrative of male victimhood, okay? This doesn't mean that every person who enters these spaces becomes explicitly violent, okay? But it also doesn't mean that male suffering should be dismissed. The point here is different, okay? The point is that these communities offer interpretative frames. They tell users how to understand their pain, who to blame for it, and how to turn it into belonging. Okay, so this is where the connection with digital gender-based violence becomes clearer. The manosphere contributes to digital gender-based violence not only when its members directly harass, threaten, or attack women online, okay? It also contributes by producing and circulating a cultural environment in which misogyny becomes common sense. Violence is minimized. Women who speak are discredited. Feminism is presented as domination, and male resentment is legitimized as political truth. So, before moving to the specific forms of online violence, I want to clarify what I mean by digital gender-based violence, because there is no single universally accepted way to name violence that takes place through digital technologies. Different expressions are used depending on the aspect one wants to emphasize. For example, we may speak of online violence when we want to stress the space in which violence occurs. We may speak of digital violence when we want to emphasize the technological mediation of violent practices. Or we may speak of technology-facilitated violence when we want to underline that technology and technologies do not necessarily create violence from nothing, that's easy to understand, but can make violence easier, faster, more pervasive, and even more difficult to escape, okay? In other cases, we can talk about this type of violence using more specific expressions, okay? Cyber violence, cyberbullying, online harassment, image-based sexual abuse, and so on. These terms are not simply interchangeable. Each of them brings a different dimension into focus, okay? Brings light to a different dimension. The digital space, the technological device, the circulation of images, and so on. So, today I will mainly use the expression digital gender-based violence, and I do it because it allows us to keep together two dimensions that are often separated in the public and social discourse, in public and social perception, okay? On the one hand, the role of digital technologies, platforms, algorithms, and visibility, and on the other hand, the fact that these practices are deeply connected to gendered power relations, to misogyny, to sexual norms, and to the social regulation of women's bodies, sexuality, and credibility. So, when I speak of digital gender-based violence, I do not simply mean violence that happens online, okay? What I mean is gender violence that is reorganized, amplified, and made visible through digital technologies. Now we can ask, which form can this violence take? We already mentioned some forms of violence, of digital gender-based violence. For example, non-consensual intimate image sharing, that is the circulation of intimate images or videos without the consent of the person represented in them. And this can happen, for example, when an ex-partner shared shares intimate images received, for example, during relationship or produced through sexting. It can include, for example, upskirting. Upskirting is the production of images taken without consent of the person, of the woman represented in it, in order to expose intimate parts of the body. And it happens in public space. Generally, it happens in public space like buses, metro, and so on. It can include sexual deep fakes, where generative artificial intelligence is used to create false explicit images or videos, for example, by placing a woman's face into pornographic material. And it can include sextortion. Sextortion occurs when someone threatens to circulate intimate material in order to obtain money, sexual acts, attention, renewed contact, or control. And it can include doxing, that is the publication of private information such as address, phone number, workplaces, or personal contacts, with the aim of intimidating, exposing, or making a woman vulnerable to further attacks. And it also, of course, can include cyberbullying, catfishing, misogynistic campaign, public delegitimization, and online hate speech, okay? These forms can be strongly connected one to the other, okay? So, they are different, of course, but they have something in common. They attack the woman through visibility, okay? They weaponize exposure. They turn the body, reputation, sexuality, credibility, or private life of a woman into something publicly available for judgment, ridicule, control, or punishment. This is why digital violence is a form of gender-based violence, because gender-based violence has always involved control, humiliation, isolation, intimidation, and the regulation of women's bodies and sexuality. And digital technologies do not invent these dynamics, okay? They reorganize them. They make them faster, as we already said, more visible, as we already said, more persistent, and often more difficult to escape, as we already mentioned before. At this point, maybe it can be useful to understand why platforms matter. Okay, the digital world is not separated from the so-called or once so-called real world. Online and offline spaces are connected through a circular relationship. What happens online can reinforce, amplify, or transform social relations that already exist offline. And at the same time, what happens offline can be translated into online languages, memes, hashtags, comments, videos, and reaction. So when we speak about digital violence, we should not imagine the web as just a neutral tool, okay? Platforms are both a field and an instrument. They are a field because social actors meet, organize, and produce meanings and build identities there. But they're also instruments because they provide specific technical possibilities: commenting, sharing, remixing, screenshotting, forwarding, and so on. So digital platforms are now central spaces for the production and circulation of public discourse. They organize what becomes visible, what disappears, what attracts attention, and what becomes socially relevant. This visibility is produced through platform architectures, okay? Through algorithmic selection and user interaction. This means that digital gender-based violence is not only a matter of individual cruelty or individual deviance, just like offline gender-based violence, it's not, okay? Of course, individuals act, harass, threaten, expose, but their action take place inside an environment that can amplify humiliation, reward conflict, and transform violence into spectacle. Okay, here the concept of attention economy is crucial. Attention is something limited, and platforms, content creators, and so on compete for it. Okay, in this environment, the most visible content is not necessarily the most accurate, the most ethical, or the most socially useful. Very often, the most visible content is the most emotionally intense. What do I mean? This is why rage bait is so effective. You know, rage bait refers to the content designed to provoke anger or indignation. And it works because emotional reactions are measurables. Likes, comments, stitches, duets, share, quote posts, and reaction. So even when users react critically, they may contribute to the circulation of that same content. So this happens because platforms doesn't necessarily distinguish between agreement or disagreement, okay? It sees interaction. And this mechanism is particularly relevant for digital violence because humiliation can become content and public attacks can become entertainment and victim blame can become debate. So, and misogyny, of course, can become irony. And we know that irony is one of the most powerful languages of the digital environment, no? Memes are a good example. A meme may appear just to be a joke, an image, a short video, a caption, a remix. But memes are also political and cultural artifacts. They produce shared meanings, they translate public issues into popular culture. They can be, of course, used to criticize power, to resist dominant narratives, and to build feminist counterpolitics, just to make an example. But they can also be used as weapons to mock victims, to normalize violence, to trivialize abuse, and to spread misogynistic repertoires under the protection of humor. This ambiguity is important, it's crucial. The same digital form can be used for resistance or for attack. A meme can support survivors, but a meme can also turn a survivor into a punchline. Okay? Now, let us return briefly to the manosphere. The manosphere benefits from these platform dynamics because its contents are often emotionally intense, polarizing, ironic, conflictual, and easily mimified. Okay? Its repertoires can circulate beyond explicitly misogynistic spaces. This is its force. Okay, it's a main feature. They can travel through jokes, short videos, dating advice, gym culture that we already mentioned, reaction content, influencer discourse, and anti-feminist clips. This is one of its most important transformation. Manosphere repertoires can move from the margins to the mainstream. They can be localized, adapted to local context, translated into national languages, softened through irony, and embedded in ordinary platform cultures. So the boundary between extremist spaces and ordinary digital culture is not always clear. A teenager may encounter misogynistic content by not searching for hate forums, but through apparently ordinary content. The ones that we already mentioned, relationship advice, self-improvement, or even videos about male loneliness, okay? Or, for example, content or how to become more sexually attractive, successful, and so on. And this is why the manosphere should also be read as a pedagogical space. Because it teaches what women are supposed to be. It teaches what men are supposed to be and supposed to want. It teaches who deserves sex, who deserves respect, who deserves visibility, and who deserves punishment. It offers explanations that are simple, rigid, and emotionally charged. And because these explanations circulate through platforms, they may reach users who would never enter an explicitly misogynistic forum, for example. So a qualitative study that we conducted in Italy between 2020 and 2024 may be useful here. We combined different research techniques, but we made a later analysis of hashtags and public profiles on TikTok and Instagram. And the central question was not only whether young people recognize violence, but how they name it, okay? And this distinction can be very important. Recognizing that something is wrong is not the same as naming it as gender-based violence. Young people, and especially young women, may recognize control, jealousy, manipulation, pressure, or humiliation as problematic, but they may still avoid words such as victim, gender-based violence, or male violence against women. Instead, online discourse often uses other words: toxic relationship, narcissism, and the Italian youth slang for malessere, that is a term used to describe a problematic, emotionally unavailable, opportunistic, and manipulative male figure. Okay, the hashtag analysis can be revealing. On TikTok and Instagram, terms such as narcissist, toxic relationship, and of course malessere were much more visible, or at least much more integrated into everyday platform language. than the explicit category of gender-based violence. And even more interesting, posts often combine hashtags such as narcissism, toxic relationship, and malessere, while the hashtag gender-based violence was not included in the same cluster. And this may suggest a process of translation. Experiences that could be interpreted through the lens of gender-based violence are translated into the language of toxicity, pathology, emotional damage, or individual personality disorder. And this translation has ambivalent effect. Okay, on the one hand, it may help young people speak. Okay, the words toxic relationship or narcissist may feel more accessible, less stigmatizing, and even less politically loaded. And they may allow people to describe pain, control, or manipulation without immediately placing themselves in the position of victim. On the other hand, this language can neutralize the gender dimension of violence, okay? If violence becomes only the result of a narcissistic personality or of a toxic individual, then the social construction of genders and of masculinity disappears from the analysis. And gender hierarchy disappears, power disappears, and the question becomes psychological, individual rather than social. So the problems becomes the pathological individual, and not the cultural and structural condition that make certain forms of control, entitlement, and domination recognizable, tolerated, or even romanticized. Okay, and this is a central point for teaching and for prevention. It is not enough to tell young people this is violence. We must also understand why some words are rejected, why others circulate more easily, and what is lost or gained when violence is renamed as toxicity, narcissism, or drama. Okay, so the issue of victimhood is crucial. Okay, is central. Many young women may resist the word victim, and this resistance is not irrational. The category of victim is socially loaded. Okay, in public discourse, the ideal victim is often imagined as passive, morally irreproachable, coherent, fragile, and without any kind of contradictions. And a woman who is angry, sexually free, ambivalent, ironic, contradictory, or who has made choices that others judge negatively may be seen as less credible. So this is where secondary victimization enters the room, okay? Secondary victimization occurs when a woman who reports or discloses violence is subjected to further scrutiny, blame, disbelief, or moral judgment. And in digital spaces, this process can become massive. The person is not only judged by institutions, police, courts, or media. She is judged by thousands of users, okay? Her credibility becomes a public object. Her emotional tone is analyzed, her past is searched, her photos are interpreted, even her words can turn into clips. Okay, so her contradictions are used as evidence against her. So in this sense, platforms can create a kind of informal court. There is the legal court, but there is also the social court. And there is the formal jury, but there is also an online jury made of comments, memes, hashtags, reaction videos, and influencers. And this online jury doesn't need rules of evidence. It works through visibility, emotions, and repetition. And this is connected to the idea of epistemic injustice. That means that some people are considered less credible because of social stereotypes, and in cases of gender-based violence, women's testimonies can be discounted, not because of the evidence, but because of prejudice about women, that they lie, that they exaggerate, manipulate, that they regret consensual sex, for example, or that they seek revenge or to destroy men's lives. And the manosphere fits precisely on these stereotypes, okay? It provides a ready-made interpretative frame. Women are not victims, they are strategic. Feminism is not liberation, it is domination. And anti-violence discourse is not protection, it is an attack on men. Male suffering become the real hidden truth. Okay? So in this way, the manosphere doesn't simply deny violence. It reverses the moral order. Men become the true victims, and women who speak become the aggressors. This reversal is powerful because it is emotionally satisfying for those who feel disposed, humiliated, or maybe even anxious about changing gender relations. But we should be really careful here. The aim is not to pathologize men or boys. The aim is to understand how certain digital cultures offer scripts of masculinity. And these social scripts tell boys and men how to interpret rejection, desire, sexuality, humiliation, failure, and power. Okay? So some scripts may open space for responsibility and equality, of course, but others transform frustration into resentment and resentment into misogyny. And at this point, maybe it could be useful to summarize the theoretical model I've been using today. So first, the manosphere is a heterogeneous ecosystem of male-dominated online communities. Second, it can be read as a part of a broader anti-feminism backlash. And third, it works as an emotional community, organizing frustration, humiliation, and resentment into collective narratives of male victimhood. Fourth, these narratives contribute to digital gender-based violence by legitimizing misogyny, victim blaming, harassment, and delegitimating women's voices, okay? Fifth, the platforms amplify these processes because visibility is shaped by algorithms, attention economies, emotional intensity, and interaction. Six, digital violence works through exposure, harassment, image-based abuse, and public delegitimization. And this leads us to the seventh point. Younger generation may recognize violence, but don't always name it as gender-based violence. The language of toxicity, narcissism, and other kind of languages. In the Italian case was malessere, but it may be named differently in other places. And these words may make pain speakable, but it may also hide gender power relations. Okay? So this doesn't mean that platforms are only spaces of violence. They are also spaces of awareness, solidarity, feminist mobilization, and resistance. And many survivors do find words, communities, and support online. And young people can use digital languages to denounce abuse, create counter-narratives, interrupt the circulation, for example, of non-consensual images, or challenge victim blaming and make violence visible, okay? But the ambivalence remains, and the ambivalence is the main focus, okay? That we have to keep in mind when we are talking about gender-based violence and digital gender-based violence. Digital media can promote awareness and social change, but they can also amplify backlash, misogyny, and the extraction of attention from suffering. And this ambivalence, again, is the key point, okay? So the question is not, are platforms good or bad? The question is, under what conditions do platforms amplify violence? And under what conditions they can support recognition, responsibility, and transformation? And for education, this means that we need more than technical literacy. It is not enough to tell students how to protect passwords or report content, although this is obviously important, but we need also gender and sociological literacy, for example. We need to ask who is made visible, who is believed, who is disbelieved, who is ridiculed, which emotions are rewarded, okay? Which words become impossible to speak online, and what kind of masculinity and femininity is being performed online, okay? To conclude, the manosphere is not only, and it's not simply an online subculture of angry men. It is part of a broader conflict over gender, power, and visibility. And digital violence is not simply the online version of offline violence. It is a technological mediated form of gender power shaped by platform, affordances, algorithms, attention economies, emotional communities, and public judgment. So to study and to talk about the manosphere and about digital gender-based violence, we must therefore keep together four levels. The first level, that is cultural, the persistence of misogynistic and anti-feminist repertoires. The second one, that is technological, the role of platforms, visibility, virality, and algorithm amplification. The third level, that is affective, the way negative emotions such as frustration, resentment, and loneliness are organized into communities. And the fourth level is the relational and symbolic, the ways in which young people name violence, distance themselves from victimhood, and negotiate the boundary between irony, toxicity, pathology, and gender-based violence. Only by keeping these levels together, we can avoid two mistakes. The first mistake is to reduce digital violence to individual pathology, and the second mistake is to reduce platforms to neutral tools. Thank you.